Thank you very much, Sian, for the introduction, and thank you very much to Hedayah for the invitation to join you today on behalf of UNDP to present one of the studies in UNDP's Prevention of Violent Extremism series, The Journey to Extremism in Africa, Pathways to Recruitment and Disengagement. Just to note that this is a follow-up study. The first study had been done in 2017 that looked predominantly at reintegration, recruitment. And the follow-up study, we wanted to look at both recruitment and disengagement. So to start off with, we were looking at what have been responses to violent extremism over the past 10 years. And we found that it continues to be dominated heavily by security-driven approaches. In the last decade, in the 8 countries that we reviewed, we found that there had been an increase in terms of humanitarian responses, which also speaks to the context in which these countries are in, needing an increase in humanitarian support. And when we looked at PVE-related sectors, including peace building, we found that this remained consistently low and underfunded at about 2%. So really highlighting more of a reactionary approach in terms of overseas development assistance. The Institute of Economics and Peace have come up with this interesting statistic in terms of the ratio of 16:1, meaning that for every dollar invested in peace building, it is estimated that $16 could be saved. Despite the evidence, and also whenever we have these reviews of peace building, we do see the importance and the cost saving, not only in terms of dollar amounts, but in terms of impact, in terms of human lives, in terms of reversal of development. We still find a predominance of reactionary approaches. Just trying to, okay. When we look at the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and looking at the 4 pillars, we still see, again, a focus more on measures to combat terrorism. So again, in terms of the reactionary response, in terms of 73%, and in terms of looking at addressing conditions conducive to the growth of terrorism, this is at only 24%. And in terms of measures to respect human rights and rule of law, this is only at 3%, which becomes key when we go into the findings in terms of, in particular, the trigger points. Despite also this heavy investment to combat terrorism, what we still see is an increase in attacks. And when we're looking at the African continent, in terms of a spread, in terms of violent extremism and terrorist activity, when we did the first study in 2017, it was mostly in West and Eastern Africa, specifically the Horn, and now we've seen more of a growth in terms of the Great Lakes region as well as Southern Africa. When we embarked on the 2023 study, we wanted to look at the changing nature of violent extremism and to really take stock of efforts to counter or prevent its spread since the first study was published in 2017. We also wanted to analyze the drivers, tipping points, and accelerators, as well as identify resilience or protective factors. We wanted to delve into pathways from extremism and examine disengagement, or what is termed as de-radicalization. What are the turning points, particularly for those who voluntarily leave groups? And also to further strengthen the gender lens, a dimension which is often overlooked in policy or programming in the PCVE field. In terms of the approach, we applied a political socialization theory. And we wanted to, through this approach, uncover what is termed as a journey map of critical enabling factors, drivers, and triggers into recruitment as well as disengagement processes. We interviewed almost 2,200 individuals, 75% male, 25% female, across 8 countries: Burkina Faso, Chad, Cameroon, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. Just to mention that there was the primary group of about 1,181 individuals who had been or still were members of violent extremist groups, and then similar to the first journey report, comparing them with a reference group of individuals who came from similar backgrounds, geographic areas. Most of the interviews, just to mention, took place in more of these borderland peripheral areas for the reference group where there had been high recruitment, to compare the two and also to identify, more of these resilience factors as well. This just gives you a bit of a snapshot in terms of the demographic sample that we interviewed. You will notice also the number of youth who were interviewed, and also just to note a significant difference is a high increase in terms of engagement of children in violent extremist groups. So this was a marked increase from 2017, and we see from children as young as 10 to 17, quite a sharp increase in terms of membership. So to go into the findings, from the pathways to recruitment, we found that the most cited reason for joining was for employment opportunities, and this was at 25% of the voluntary recruits. But it's worth noting that there wasn't a significant correlation between unemployment and susceptibility to violent extremism. So of this 25%, over 60% were already employed and were married. It's an interesting element, and what we did find when we were unpacking in terms of issues of grievance, we found that about 73% cited that they were dissatisfied with employment opportunities that were available to them, provided by the government in the areas in which they lived. The study confirms a statistically significant relationship between lack of religious education and susceptibility to violent extremism. This is consistent with the 2017 study, where we find that those who cite religious ideological reasons for joining often have little or limited understanding of religious texts. And in this study also indicated that they needed someone to interpret the texts for them. One significant difference, though, in 2017, we had almost 50% of voluntary recruits citing religious ideology as a reason for joining, and in 2023, this was only at 17%, so quite a significant difference. We also looked at elements of trust, and this was quite an interesting finding in terms of not seeing a statistical relationship between levels of trust and susceptibility to violent extremism. In fact, there were low levels of trust, particularly in national state institutions, security, justice, military actors. And this was at 58% with the voluntary recruits and 50% among the reference group counterparts. So this really exhibits an overall frame, say, of the social contract within these areas. We wanted to further look at the element of a trigger event, and of 48% of voluntary recruits who cited that they had experienced a trigger event, many experienced short, punctuated, sharp escalations of human rights abuses, such as government action, killing, or arrest of a family member or friend, and this stood at 71%, similar to the 2017 study. And just to draw your attention back in terms of the commitments in terms of human rights pledges, it stood at only 3%. Another interesting finding was that low levels of access to information and communication increases vulnerability to recruitment. Recruits that never used or lacked access to internet at the time of joining joined more quickly than others. Overall, we found that among the voluntary recruits in our study, they were more vulnerable when they were more isolated and had less contact with people of other ethnic groups, religions, and lower access to information. Well, just to highlight one of the gendered findings is we found that male recruits were more likely to join with friends and female recruits with family, in particular their husbands. Turning to pathways to disengagement, 77% of those who chose to leave voluntarily through surrender or amnesty said that their expectations were not met. There was disappointment, particularly in the monetary rewards, and this was more so with those who joined quickly. And just to mention that in terms of speed of joining, it varied from about 1 month to 1 year. There was also high disillusionment with the group's ideology and or actions, which were key in terms of triggering a turning point. And in terms of the ideology, we see also a significant difference between male and female respondents, with 85% of females citing no longer believing and in the group ideology compared to 62% of males. We also see a cascading effect in terms of disengagement patterns linked very closely to the decision of family, friends, and community members to leave. And 40% of those who disengage voluntarily from violent extremist groups stated that government incentives and amnesty programs influenced their decision to leave. This just gives you a bit of a snapshot in terms of the reasons for leaving. As mentioned in the previous slide, either no longer agreeing with the group's actions, going to elements of injustice, torture, physical exhaustion, and also in terms of the chart below, looking at also the differences between the male and female respondents. In terms of the policy implications, the first is really the importance in terms of oversight of human rights compliance, rule of law, and accountability in terms of counterterrorism responses. The second, as we note in terms of the fraying overall of the social contract, the need to really invest in reinvigorating, restoring social contract, particularly at the local levels. There are opportunities as we see higher levels of trust, for example, in local leaders, as well as with religious leaders. In terms of, again, restoring the social contract, trying to strengthen state legitimacy through improved service delivery, quality and accountability of state service provision. We found, for example, in Mali with the voluntary recruits, 83% had better hope and faith in terms of what was provided by the violent extremist groups than the state. Embedding a conflict-sensitive approach in efforts to address violent extremism. And what we often see also is targeting of particular groups, which can also be counterproductive in terms of prevention. So really ensuring proper analysis and not targeting specific populations, having more of this conflict-sensitive approach, which is also important, in terms of return to ensure that also individuals are not targeted. Upscaling support for localized community-based human security approaches to preventing violent extremism. And this really speaks to more of a holistic approach in terms of addressing risks and vulnerabilities towards joining violent extremist groups. And when we're also looking at those who are returning, ensuring that they are not returning to the same conditions in which they left. Really reinvigorating PVE within peace building and sustainable development frameworks. We've seen on the continent the growth of PVE approaches has been somewhat parallel, but also being able to leverage on, for example, infrastructures for peace, early warning and early response systems, which are well developed, local peace committees. So really ensuring that there are opportunities for ensuring a PVE approach within peace building and sustainable development. And really recalibrating the commitment to more cost-effective prevention and long-term development rather than reactive approaches. As I mentioned earlier, we have a whole PVE report series. And in terms of the overall messaging, what we are seeing, and when we look at the Global Terrorism Index of 2023, we see the Sahel region really emerging as the new epicenter of violent extremism, representing 43% of global terrorism deaths. 4 out of the 10 most affected countries globally are in the Sahel, and the 5th is Somalia. And the hub of terrorism is really moving towards countries facing political instability, are within conflict ecosystems, and we're also looking at elements of ecological degradation. It's very clear from the evidence that standalone security responses do not work. There needs to be more of a balance in terms of approaches and more investment in complementary prevention, development, and support to return, and also looking at highly localized root causes of violent extremism that need to be addressed by development-based solutions. Besides the dominant security-centered responses to counter violent extremism, ODA flows to address violent extremism continue to be reactionary. And again, this is despite the strong evidence. And finally, over the number of years where there have been efforts in terms of addressing violent extremism, we have a number of good practices in terms of PVE and stabilization approaches, which can be scaled up. Just to mention a few, in Northern Cameroon, there's a human rights observatory, which involves community-based organizations, religious leaders, doing the monitoring, having structured engagement with the military. This has helped in terms of trust building, also an increase in reporting and a decrease in terms of joining. Looking at also providing economic opportunities, livelihoods to at-risk youth, as well as leadership and mentorship. And we see that in Nigeria, through such a program, we had about 94% of these targeted youth indicating that they had hope for the future. In terms of return under the stabilization program, again in Nigeria, we have the development of model villages, such as Ngaranam, which was under the lead of the Borno state government, where there is restoration of markets, building of houses, livelihoods, opportunities provided, starter grants, and so on. And in terms of embedding within more development planning and approaches, in Kenya, we see the good example of the county action plans. For example, in Mombasa County, multi-stakeholder platforms to support their implementation, as well as monitoring and having this embedded within local government. So just to conclude, I will leave you with a quote. And as you noted throughout the presentation, we did try to, have these quotes throughout the report to really go beyond the statistics and to really hear the voices of these respondents. Thank you.